All right, good morning, everyone. It's time for us to go ahead and get started. Let's open our Bibles to Matthew 21. Matthew 21. We have been studying the parables for the last few weeks, and so far we have discussed what a parable is, and then have looked at a handful of parables already. We've looked at the parable of the mustard seed from Matthew 13, the parable of leaven from Matthew 13, and then we've also looked at two more parables there in Matthew 13, the hidden treasure and the pearl of great price. And so those are the ones that we have evaluated so far. We're going to pick up in Matthew 21 this morning, and we're going to look at what this curriculum calls the parable of the wicked husbandman. However, if you have probably a more modern translation, this is going to be referred to as the parable of the tenants. That's another way that it's phrased, the parable of the tenants. And so we're going to read Matthew 21, 33 through 45. I've got three that we may be able to get through this morning. We'll see. And so this is the one we'll start with. Matthew 21, verses 33 through 45. Kind of a longer parable. So the ones we've looked at up to this point have been, sort of shorter parables, really condensed. Some of them 2 verses, 3 verses, or 1 verse. Now we're getting into some of the longer parables, and this is going to be one example of that. Matthew 21, verses 33 through 45. We'll read this together. The parable of the wicked husbandman, or the parable of the tenants. Let's look at these together. Matthew 21:33. Hear another parable. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it, and dug a winepress in it, and built a tower, and leased it to tenants, and went into another country. When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenant took his servant and beat one, and killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other servants more than the first, and they did the same. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, They will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and have his inheritance. And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, He will put those wretches into a miserable death, and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their season. Jesus said to them, Have you never read in the Scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to the people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. When it falls on anyone, it will crush him. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parable, they perceived he was speaking about them. This is an example of a parable that we have not seen up to this point. Now, the parables we've looked at so far in Matthew 13 were all, I guess you could say, short, proverbial or aphoristic style parables. They're quick, short, to the point. Jesus gives no explanation to them whatsoever. This, however, is a parable that we can with pretty, good certainty say we know exactly what this parable means. The reason is because Jesus goes on to explain, at least in some part, what he was speaking about. The parable of the tenants, or the parable of the wicked husbandman. Okay, now let's talk about this parable for a few moments. The basic gist of it is that a landowner owns a vineyard. He plants a vineyard, builds a tower. He's got this property that needs to be managed. And so, because it needs to be managed, he leases it out to someone to live there, a tenant, in order to take care of it while he's gone. Now, he goes away, and then the time for harvest comes, and he decides, hey, I want to reap the benefits of my property, the vineyard that's there. I want to get its fruit and benefit from it. Probably sell it, take that to market, make a good payday on it. He sends his servants to collect the fruit, but when they arrive, the story goes that the people who lived there, the tenants, they beat and stoned and killed the servants that the master or the landowner sent to them. And so he makes this decision, hey, instead of servants, let's get a little more personal. I'm going to send my son to them, and they'll respect my son. But they kill his son too, and they do so hoping to seize his inheritance. Now, this is probably one of the clearest parables that I think Jesus taught outside of the ones like the parable of the sower, maybe even the parable of the prodigal son. This is one of the clearest ones he ever gave. A couple of things to point out. You've got some characters and some things in this parable that we know beyond any doubt exactly what they are. The first one is that the landowner or the house owner is representative of God. God is the man who owns the property, who has the tower and the vineyard, who leases it out, who sends his servant, who sends his son. That in this parable represents God. The vineyard, however, we believe to represent the nation of Israel. The reason is because of how Jesus explains this just a little bit. In verse 43, if you'll pull that up there, Bailey, he says, "Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you." Well, who's he talking to? You jump down to verse 45. The chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parable, and they perceived he was speaking about them. So we kind of deduce that Jesus is talking to Jews, maybe the religious leaders of the time, Israel, and the vineyard represents, I guess, overall the nation of Israel. Now, this is not the first time that the nation of Israel has been referred to as a vineyard. I'll take you to one Old Testament passage, Isaiah chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 1 through 7. In Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, here's how the Lord describes his vineyard in this passage. "Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it. He hewed out the wine vat in it, and he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. Now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I look for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? Now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge. It shall be devoured. I will break down its walls, and it shall be trampled down." This is an explanation in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 5 here, of God basically prophetically telling the people of Israel what's going to happen to them. Verse 6, I will make it waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they will rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. Okay, it is the house of Israel. And the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, and behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, and behold, an outcry. This is God's judgment on the people of Israel. He took care of this vineyard. The people of Israel represented this place that God had curated for them. He had given them a place of safety and protection. He had been with them. They were his chosen people, but they had, as many times we see in the Old Testament, turned their back on him. And God outlines, that there's going to be punishment for them. So it's not a stretch to say that the vineyard from Matthew 21 is Israel. It's the nation of Israel, the people of Israel. Now, when you look at this particular parable, we'll go back here, Bailey, to Matthew 21. You also have the tenants or the husbandmen. The tenants or the husbandmen, the people who occupied the vineyard. Okay, if the nation of Israel is the vineyard, then the religious Jewish leaders would have been the tenants that lived there. Okay, the people who were in charge, the people who God set up to be in charge. You also have the servants that are mentioned here. I'm going to show you a couple of cross references here in a minute. The servants probably represent the prophets of the Old Testament. Now, it makes sense because he says in this parable that they stoned and they beat and they killed the servants. Well, that's exactly what they did to the prophets in the Old Testament. They stoned and beat them and killed them. And then, of course, the son from this parable would represent Jesus. Now, Jesus makes this clear claim in verse 43, and we've already looked at it once, but I'll remind you of it. I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to the people producing its fruit. we understand the premise of how the gospel plan of salvation in the dispensation of Jesus' time played out. Jesus sent the apostles to preach first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. Most of the apostles were commissioned to go to the Jews. There were a select few who were commissioned to specifically go to the Gentiles. Paul was one of them. You remember in Acts chapter 10, Jerome just went through the book of Acts. He talked about Cornelius in that passage. Cornelius goes and brings the first non-Jew convert into the church with the story of Cornelius and his household. There were a few apostles that went to the Gentiles, but the majority of them were focused mainly first on the Jews. God extended the kingdom of heaven to the Jews first. The problem is, as he extended it to them, they rejected it. Jesus even quotes here in his discussion here in verse 42 about the stone the builders rejected. That is full-fledged 1 Peter and 2 Peter. If you read 1 and 2 Peter, you find Peter constantly talking about the stone that was rejected, the stone that became the cornerstone, Jesus being that stone that the builders rejected. The Jews turned away Jesus. They wanted nothing to do with him. They killed him, just as this parable outlines. Now, don't miss that Jesus is telling this parable before this happens, that the son is killed. And that's exactly what comes to be later in this gospel account, not far from where we're at here in Matthew 21. A couple of things I'd like us to, evaluate and learn from in this particular parable. The first one is that Jesus, being the Son, the prophets being the servants, the Jews being the tenants, and the nation of Israel being the vineyard, it teaches us this principle that I think you and I need to understand, in that God entrusts His system to the hands of men. In the parable, God, being the man who owned the land, entrusted the care of the land to the tenants. It was up to them to prune it, to weed it, to take care of it, to harvest it. The only thing He sent the servants to do was to come and get the fruit or the things that benefited from the vineyard and to sell them. In the same way, God in the Old Testament entrusted His plan to the Jews. Now, He outlined what they were supposed to do. He outlined what He expected of them, but it was up to them to fulfill it. It was up to them to fulfill His Mosaic law, the Levitical priesthood, the sacrifices, the tabernacle practices, then the temple practices, the purification laws. God outlined everything for them to do, but it was up to them to fulfill it, to follow it. The same is true for our world today. God has entrusted to us His system. He's outlined to us what the church is. He's outlined to us how it should be led, how it should be organized, what worship should be like, how you and I are to be the conduit that takes the message to the people. And He outlines it all, but He entrusts it to us. The same as this parable, you and I should understand that God entrusts His systems to man, but man is ultimately accountable for what